Hello, so I have decided to do the Time and Place book tag created by Jen Campbell. I was not tagged, but I saw Jen Campbell's original video and really enjoyed it, so I thought I'd do my own. So the goal of this tag is to choose 10 books which remind you of a time and a place. So for my first book, I have chosen Hugh MacLean's Scotchman's Return and Other Essays. This is a collection of essays about everything from his time at Oxford to, let's see, I don't really remember much about these essays. Actually, I remember more about where I bought it and what the day felt like when I bought it. So I picked this book up secondhand, obviously, because this is an older copy. It's actually out of print, I believe, but I picked this up at Old Goat Books, a bookstore in a nearby city. Old Goat Books is in this old yellow brick house, and the first floor is the bookstore, and it's floor to ceiling bookshelves, everything packed in, and I've only been there once, but it's a really lovely bookshop. For my second book, I have chosen Villette by Charlotte Bronte. I chose this because I remember reading it when I was 14, the summer after I finished grade 9. On the last day of school, I went straight to the library and I picked out a big stack of classics, one of them being Villette, and this was the very first book that I read to start off summer vacation between grade 9 and 10. I also remember it because this is the first book that I wrote down when I started keeping a book log. I've been keeping a book log since Villette. I write down everything I read, title, author, date I began reading it on, and the date I finished it on. And more recently, I've been keeping track of the copyright date and the national origin of the author. So my third book is The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. I chose this book because I have a very distinct, vivid memory of reading it at school. I read it in my last year of high school in the spring. I had a spare first period, and I remember going out into the enclosed courtyard in the center of my school and sitting on a picnic bench alone and just reading this in the early morning. And my next book is Airport by Arthur Hailey. This is basically a novel about, well, an airport. Obviously, everything happens within 24 hours at the most, I believe. There's a snowstorm and I think a terrorist. I chose this book because I remember reading it out in my backyard on a lounge chair. It was my first summer working at the restaurant where I currently work. I was trying to read quite quickly because I had to go to work. I wanted to finish the book before I went in because I really wasn't looking forward to the dish shift I had to work. Thankfully, I no longer work in dishes. My next book is Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell. I read this book about 3 or 4 times in my life. I read it for the first time when I was 12 years old. And I remember it because I was quite proud, actually, that I could read it in such a short time. It took me about 2 weeks, but at 1,000 pages in 2 weeks seemed very good. I also remember reading this because I watched the movie from 1939, which remains to this day one of my favorite movies. So next I have The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test by Tom Wolfe. This is literary journalism, I guess. It's, well, Tom Wolfe, famous journalist. Tom Wolfe spent a great deal of time traveling around with Ken Kesney and his merry pranksters in the late 60s. They were doing a lot of acid and they had a very colorful bus. It's quite a well-written and exciting piece of journalism. I chose this book because I remember what I was doing the day I read it. I read it in my second year of university. I got to campus very early that day at 6:30 and I had the book with me in my bag, and I ended up reading it for a half an hour because the person I was waiting for was late. I had been writing for an independent student newspaper that ideally was supposed to be bi-weekly, but it never was because the editor never quite got it together in time. We were supposed to distribute the newspaper that morning, and we did. And then when we were done, I asked the guy I had met if he would like to have coffee with me, and he said yes, and that was one of the most enjoyable mornings that I ever spent. And then afterwards, when he left, I sat and read this book until it was time for my class. Unfortunately, it did not work out, but yeah, I remember this book. And the next book I've chosen is Trudeau Transformed, The Shaping of a Statesman, 1944 to 1965. This is one of the biographies written by Max and Monique Nemne. Pierre Trudeau, obviously, former Prime Minister of Canada. When I was in my last year of high school, I had a bit of an obsession with Pierre Trudeau. I read 3 or 4 biographies by him, and this was by far my favorite biography. The next book I have is the autobiography of Abbie Hoffman. I read this book last summer, and I remember I had 2 classes that day. I was taking summer classes. One class ended at 9:50 in the morning, and I didn't have another class until 4:30 in the afternoon. So I took my bag and I went to a local park. And I was reading this on a park bench when it started to rain. I just remember waiting out the rain under an old bandstand in the park, and I was there all alone and just rain coming down around me, and very peaceful and very beautiful. My next book is The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. I chose this book because I read it with a friend. We went through it chapter by chapter and discussed each portion when we were done reading it via email. And the next book I've chosen is Dracula by Bram Stoker. My copy is the illustrated Dracula with photographs from the 1931 film adaptation with Bela Lugosi, which is by far the best film adaptation, and I really enjoy that one. I chose this one because I remember reading it, once again, as with the feminist mystique, in my last year of high school during my spare. It was too late in the school year to check books out of the library anymore, so I kept taking a copy of Dracula from the shelf every morning during my spare and reading it in the library until I finished it. And then of course I went and got the 1931 movie from the public library and watched that and thoroughly enjoyed it. The best way to watch that one is by turning out all the lights and making a bowl of popcorn. And my final book I've chosen is Pulitzer, A Life in Politics, Print, and Power. This is a biography of the life of Pulitzer. He owned a bunch of newspapers. Obviously, the Pulitzer Prize, a journalism award, is named after him. I chose this one mainly because I remember reading it over the Christmas break one year. I believe it was in my first year of university. I had just come back from visiting family in the States, and I remember finishing it, lying on the living room floor, listening to some Willie Nelson records I had just bought.